Hello, citizens of the Republic of Bunga. It's Alpha Bunga Bunga. The date is Thursday, the 12th of November, though you, dear patron, are probably hearing this a little bit later on. My name is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and this podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, who are in the UK. Hello.
Hey.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
How's it going?
Good afternoon. It's afternoon here for me, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter because we're here to talk about why culture blows, why culture totally sucks and is a waste of time. I think this is at least what I've been briefed on. This is what George has told me this episode is about. But I'll hand over to him to explain a little bit more.
Yeah, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my Graham Coxon CDs. That's
kind of obscure, George. That's kind of obscure.
It's very obscure.
And
no, so we're talking.
Taste, more importantly.
See, we've already started talking about culture. Always talking about it. So today we're I guess talking about who works in the culture industries, who consumes culture, what are the benefits of culture, and we have we're joined by one of the authors of a recent book, Culture is Bad for You. So not exactly hedging their bets on that. To discuss all of these things. So yeah, looking forward to talking with Mark about this.
I mean, it's a spicier title, and then when you get into it, you're like, okay, this is about what it seems like about inequality in cultural production and cultural consumption, which is kind of interesting. So I'm kind of interested to hear about that. I mean, I guess more specifically about the UK context, but I'm sure a lot of this stuff will have wider resonance.
Were you just thinking it was going to be like a 200-page list of here's all the bad culture that you
things that suck? Yeah.
Last season of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
All reality TV.
Well, that's the low-hanging fruit.
Et cetera.
And then it goes up to higher, less easily accessible fruit, which is the tastier fruit, I'm told. Anyway, let's start babbling. Let's call Mark up.
You get to see behind the curtain here, Mark.
I really feel like I'm learning a lot here.
It's like Greg Wallace when he goes into the factory to see how Weetabix are made. But this is not.
The thing is, like, to my shame, I do enjoy those. I mean, actually, no, this is gold. Like, because you're about to ask me what culture do I like? Am I willing to defend? And I feel like Greg Wallace is pretty much plumbing the depths.
Yeah, and plum is also relevant because he used to be a greengrocer, so it's all the neat circle.
Like plums, like the fruit.
Yeah, you see, I can't believe you're wasting this content on the pre-show. So the other thing is, presumably, I don't know if you're doing or have already done, and in like the bit of the intro that I'm not in.
Yes. We talked about how much we're looking forward to talking about the book and calling you up. And
there was a thing about
and here he is now.
And there was a thing about fruit. So if you can drop in as many fruit references as possible as you go along,
that'll be fine.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
What a pro! What a pro!
I'm really not doing all of the things that I should be doing. How would you like to be introduced? This is the really embarrassing bit where, I mean, just like a sociologist, we could just read from the back of the book. But how would you like to be introduced?
Oh God, say something like Mark is an academic at the University of Sheffield who's interested in inequalities in culture.
Cool.
And possibly say, is the author of Culture is Bad for You with Orion Brooke and Dave O'Brien.
Would you be willing to talk shit about your co-authors?
I mean, I can probably gently take the piss out of them as the conversation continues.
Okay, wonderful.
So one thing, in case you didn't already know, Orion is pronounced Orion rather than Orion, which is a mistake that other people have made.
Yeah.
Okay, author with. Sorry, just to check. How's
Orion's
is that
belt.
Dave or is that Dave?
Dave.
So it's I mispronounce everybody's name, so it's Orion.
It's Orion.
Orion's belt. You know, like Orion's belt. Constellation.
Orion. It's not hard, George.
Jorian.
Like the fruit. Yes, thank you.
we're very happy to be joined this evening by Mark Taylor. Is an academic at the University of Sheffield who's interested in inequalities and culture, and the author with Dave O'Brien and Orion Brooke of Culture is Bad for You. So Mark, how's it going?
Yeah, really good. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. So just to kick things off, before we get into some of the heavier discussion around cultural production, who consumes culture, what the benefits of culture are, just to get the ball rolling, what is the quote unquote worst or lowest culture thing that you would defend, just to give, I guess, listeners some background, some idea of what they're dealing with in this episode?
I'm not sure it's going to be that instructive in terms of what they're dealing with around the book, but I will defend the oeuvre of Greg Wallace. I will defend Greg Wallace going around a factory and looking surprised at the fact that factories make a lot of food. I will defend him hectoring rich people that don't know how to cook and instead buying a lot of takeaways and are surprised to learn that they accumulate a lot of salt in the process. I don't enjoy the process at all, but somehow I feel myself drawn to his egg-like head relentlessly.
So just because most of our listeners are probably not as familiar as they perhaps should be with some of the programs that he's been in, is there an international equivalent or some context to put Greg into?
I'd welcome input from the hosts. My immediate response is to say that Greg Wallace is truly individual and there's no obvious corresponding figure. It's not an ideal point of reference, but maybe Guy Fieri as, somebody who's so enthusiastic about his own bad food.
But also,
who is the
so
Brazilian
British.
Greg Wallace, Alex?
I'm not sure there is one. I can't think of and also I haven't watched really Brazilian MasterChef and that. So, but I think that the thing with Greg Wallace is that he's very British. So I think if you were trying to transpose Guy Fieri, it wouldn't just be a matter of taking the flame decalled car and clothes off and thinking, well, that, and getting rid of the bleached hair and thinking, well, that's just
Greg
the British
Wallace
version
naked.
of it. Well, no, we're talking about Guy Fieri naked, first of all. And secondly, that is not a British Guy Fieri. Just taking his clothes off will not make him British. So it's something more specific. There's something very, very British about Guy Fieri. If you watch, maybe for non-British listeners, if you've ever seen a bit of EastEnders, I don't know why you would, and I'm not sure why that would be helpful. But if you take one of the two bald brothers from that thing, but make him a cooking guy, then you kind of at least have an image of Greg Wallace.
The important thing to say about Greg Wallace is he's not a cooking guy; he's an eating guy. He's not a particularly proficient chef, but people bring him food and they care about what he thinks for reasons that are still not clear.
That is actually a very fine cultural point.
And the consumer-producer distinction, I think, is something that we'll plumb into,
exactly.
A little bit further.
But I think, shouldn't we actually all say what the worst or lowest culture thing we would defend would be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're all eating guys. I'm assuming we all eat at some point. But yeah, let's go around. I mean, this is cultural criticism at its finest. Phil, Alex, what are the worst or lowest culture thing that you would?
I was going to say you should
defend?
go first, George, as the host.
Well, I'm just thinking of something which I've had recent disagreements with people, possibly in the podcast, about. I think Line of Duty is good. It is not bad. It is exciting. It is the BBC trying to do an American TV show, and its detractors, its haters, don't really understand what drama is. They don't really understand what tension is or what character development and
you weren't asked to talk about what the critics might say in response. You were just asked to say what the worst or lowest culture thing you would defend would be.
George, are you saying that Line of Duty is as low as you're willing to go? Because this feels a lot like, again, to come back to the food theme, where they ask chefs about dirty food that they enjoy, and somebody describes making a cheese toastie that takes 45 minutes, while somebody else in the piece talks about how much they love a kebab.
Yeah, I think that is probably a fair criticism. I was trying to think through what's the worst post-rock band that I like to listen to, but that doesn't really fit the bill, does it? Phil, what about you? What about you?
Yeah, this is tricky. I think probably Family Guy.
Is this all of Family Guy?
Yeah, to the bitter end. I think
Okay.
like it's so relentlessly like obscene and cruel and crude and unremittingly unfunny as well. I think like that's got to be a part of love.
I'm glad you went there because
culture.
it would have been a bit cringe if you had insisted that it was still very funny. So I'm glad we don't have to.
Kind of it breaks through it bottoms out until it becomes funny again. It's not as clever or as it's not as clever or as incisive as satire as South Park is now. But I think I defend it because I think it's there's something about it that still rings true.
So, Phil, if we're thinking about a complete absence of satire, would you be willing to defend the new season of Spitting Image?
So I haven't actually seen anything, I've not seen a full episode. I've only been seeing clips that have been shared by other people. And mixed so far. I don't know if I would defend it all the way. The old ones, though, were pretty good.
It's going to be very hit and miss, isn't it?
But the old one was very hit and miss. And also, I only realized this retrospectively. The reason the old one is so good, in fact, is only because it's kind of you feel like it's nostalgic. It brings back a certain kind of time and place. That's why it's experienced as good. Because at the time, I don't think it was probably that good.
No, there's a reason why it got cancelled. But Alex, you're probably going to talk about some Brazilian cultural product that both simultaneously indicates your low cultural credentials and also your cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, well, high cultural credentials to everyone else.
That just shows that kind of the cultural hegemony of core countries, especially Anglo-American ones, disrespecting the cultural production of the periphery in different global perspectives.
Look, you're proving me right.
What I was gonna say, what I was gonna say is that as an eating guy, but also as a food making guy, some people call that cooking. Some people even call it cuisine. I would defend all the highest pretension of cooking as art. I buy into that shit. Alternatively, maybe that's too pretentious. I would defend the music of Typo Negative, which I recently had occasion to listen to in great depth as I was driving up a misty tropical mountain on Halloween night. No joke, true story. And it was great. It was a real experience. So yeah, Typo Negative. Check it out.
We're giving listeners recommendations as well for things to watch and listen to, but I feel like it's my responsibility, in fact it definitely is, as the host or the producer of this episode, to pull things back on track. So yeah, Mark, so the book Culture is Bad for You is the title. Why did you want to write this book?
I've been interested in inequalities in culture for a little while, and a lot of the work around inequalities in culture has been maybe like a little bit gentle and has tried to come up with ways in which culture can be salvaged, come up with ways in which we can largely defend the endeavor and the exercise, just sort of tinkering at the edges, saying, well, maybe if we solve this little problem that we've been able to diagnose, maybe everything will be okay. As I've been thinking about this stuff for a little while now, it becomes clear that none of this can be resolved with little marginal tweaks. The entire endeavor, it sort of rots from the head, effectively. And so what we've tried to do in assembling the book is to put together a slightly more expansive bit of work that doesn't just point at one or other of some of the issues with inequalities in and around culture, but also make a stronger case that this persists in a number of different ways that are endemic to the sector. They're not just coincidences or accidents, and try to put things more strongly, not saying culture is great and there's just a couple of problems that we need to solve, but to explicitly say, and that's the name of the book, culture is bad for you.
No, I think we could probably talk for quite a while about what culture means. As Raymond Williams says, it's one of the two most complex words in the English language. The most complex, in his opinion, being nature. But I think we can kind of probably get into some of those distinctions about, what is culture in a bit. Because I guess I wanted to ask you what, in researching it and actually kind of writing it, what did you do? Because there's a list at the back of the book of who you spoke to. we spoke to these 237 cultural workers in total, but could you talk us through a little bit around the research? Like, who did you talk to? What was their background, and why did you want to speak to them specifically?
So there were sort of three main things that we did. The first thing that we did, and this cuts through quite a lot of the start of the book, but also we revisit it a bit later, is use sources of data that were already out there on cultural workers. And some of that data isn't specifically about cultural workers, but if you're using something like the Labour Force Survey in the UK that has 200,000 people every quarter, there's going to be a bunch of cultural workers in there. So the first thing that we did was we looked at existing sources of data to try to understand some of these dynamics. And so when you see quotes about, for example, some risibly small number of people working in creative jobs from working class backgrounds, that's where that information has come from. The second thing that we did was we ran our own survey, which was hosted on, of all places, theguardian.com, where we had about 2,500 people who responded to that. And in that, it was pitched roughly to the effect of, do you work in cultural and creative industries? Fill in this survey about your experiences of the sector. And then the last thing that we did, as you say, is we interviewed 237 of them. And those were of the 2,500-ish people that did the survey online. And so we have, about 10% of them we interviewed for about an hour each. And so the reason why we talked to them, the thing that was instructive about the way that we got hold of them was, instead of sort of targeting, and we'll probably talk about this in a minute, but the way that the government formally classifies what you might call cultural and creative industries is quite weird. Instead of saying, well, we should be expecting roughly X% of musicians, Y% of actors, Z% of people working in software development, we wanted people who thought of themselves as cultural workers. And so that meant that we got people, we got a lot of the people who you might expect. We interviewed musicians and actors and visual artists and people working in museums and galleries and so on. We also caught quite a lot of people who worked in what you might refer to as portfolio careers, doing quite a lot of different things, partly in what you might refer to as the cultural sector and some not. In execution, and this won't come as a great surprise, if you believe the government, by far the biggest part of the creative industries is IT and software. We didn't get many of them because I think, if you were to say to people who build back-end content for Siemens, which is where a lot of this sector is, if you ask them if they worked in the creative industries, they would probably say no.
Yeah.
And so that's who we spoke to. And throughout the book, we've sort of tried to integrate some of the survey responses, telling the reader about the sort of broad patterns across the sector, but also, from having spoken to 237 people, quite a bit more about their specific experiences and their attitudes.
Yeah, no, I think having looked through the list at the back of the book, it does seem like a really wide range. But I think maybe Alex had a question about a group of important cultural workers who might potentially have been overlooked.
So George is trying
in this study.
You do this to me, and then I'm going to throw you in it, because what George wants me to ask is this question that I'm going to read out in front of me is why did you not include podcasters in cultural workers? Which is a fair point, actually, insofar as it's remunerated work, and mostly it's not. But someone has called them apparently the new punk rockers. I don't know why someone would say that. That's an absurd pretension for anyone might have. But it might have been tongue in cheek. But in any case, I guess the question is why were podcasters not included?
So there were two bits of preparation that I did in the run-up for this podcast. The first one was to think about who the new punk rockers are. So I referred to the authoritative academic source, search.twitter.com, in which I found that 90+% of references to the new punk rockers were American conservatives. But the second thing that I did was I looked back through all of our transcripts for references to podcasters. And when you claim that we didn't interview any podcasters, we actually interviewed 5. Out of the 237 people that we spoke to, 5 of them were podcasters. And the reason why this might not be obvious from reading the book is that, and you'll know this as well as anyone, for none of them was it their only job. These were people who would tell us that they worked in media or they worked in publishing. Somebody worked as a journalist and also did a weekly podcast that was published through a magazine or a newspaper or whatever else. And so, as you say, this podcasting actually captures quite a lot of contemporary cultural work really effectively. It is remunerated, but not very well. The remuneration is quite weird in that people are maybe hosting Patreons, and as opposed to having a relationship with an employer. And in most cases, it wasn't somebody's only job. Wherein, they were able to get an audience for their podcast through their other work. For example, one of the people that we spoke to, who's both a podcaster and a stand-up, the stand-up drove traffic to the podcast, but the podcast also drew traffic to the stand-up. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, podcasting really does capture some of the odd and in many ways contemporary labor relations in creative work.
You say there's no employer. You say there's no employer, but I mean, there's a whole number of podcasts who are quite clearly sponsored by a CIA, Mossad, FSB joint venture, who they have to answer to. So I mean, there are podcasts out there like that. No. They're just most likely most of the podcasts you listen to are that listener. It's just a fact.
So I'm gonna move things on from actually what was a very good answer and a better answer than the question that I'd suggested deserved. So yeah, to move on to the argument of the book a little bit, because it essentially deals with relationships between three parts of culture. Or this is my reading, and obviously disagree if this isn't correct. But what the benefits of culture are, the first thing, who works in what we would call cultural occupations, second, and thirdly, who consumes culture, who is reading books, going to the opera, listening to podcasts, as you put it, a really central, important part of modern culture. I think we'd all agree. So just to take the first of these and start with the benefits of culture, because obviously this pertains to the title of the book as well. So the title takes a pretty strong line. Culture is bad for you. Is this, do you actually think this? Because surely culture gives us all of these, abstract and concrete joys of life, and a lot of enriching human experiences. So culture can't be bad for us, can it?
So the tension is between whether culture is good for us in the Raymond Williams sense, and whether the kind of culture which is being defended by people saying that culture is good for you is good for you. That's clumsy, but you get the idea. And this gulf between different understandings of culture, I think, is really important. So if we think of culture being important because it's a space in which we can hang out with our friends and form meaningful relationships within our communities, and obviously this can take all sorts of different forms, then that's fantastic. If you look at the most recent Arts Council strategy called Let's Create, and you look at the videos, which are all about people developing things in their local community that are relevant to their heritage and their backgrounds and the people to whom they live closely, great, everybody's on board. And then you sort of take a step and you look at what the Arts Council actually spends its money on. And you find yourself maybe losing confidence in what is being defended, because as we get from the claim culture is good for you, and everyone thinks, well, of course culture is good for you, it's inspirational, and then you see what are the things actually getting, where is the money going when we make this argument. So in the second chapter where we talk about this claim that culture is good for you, and the evidence is pretty persuasive in a lot of ways. There's various arguments that I don't want to get hung up on because a lot of them are quite technical. Right. But things like, well, when you look at people participating in choirs and dance programs and music and so on, they seem to have all of these benefits. And that's true. But those benefits are limited to quite a small group of people. Similarly, you're not really seeing, as far as I understand it, there hasn't been a randomized controlled trial wherein people get allocated to this podcast to see how much it improves the quality of their lives. And, this is something that you should really be getting on. Given that culture is good for you, as we've come to understand, why isn't the Department of Health giving you £100 million?
So I guess this is one of the questions is around potentially the instrumentalization. Can you quantify the benefit of listening to Alpha Bunga Bunga on somebody's life? Can you, but to take it perhaps a more serious example, can you really quantify the experience of, you know, reading a great novel and reaching across the generations and having that kind of that very human sense that there is another voice out there, and seeing yourself reflected partly in it and seeing another world in it as well, or whatever you can put that in as highfalutin terms as you might like to. But yeah, I mean, is there a potential problem that you can measure the things that culture might have an instrumental benefit on, mental health, well-being, so on and so forth, but those aren't going to be the only benefits that culture gives?
I mean, all measurement is bad. If we want to understand whether, persuading people to, for example, attend museums on a given basis, like say, there's a lot of discussion about social prescribing at the moment. This idea that if you go to your GP and you tell them that you're depressed, then they should say to you, well, you've got to go to this gallery every Saturday. That's reductive, but it's not a million miles away from what's actually being proposed. Okay. And, you know, it sounds patronizing.
But how do you mean, Mark? So, I mean...
So how do I mean with which part?
Well, with the part about it's not a million miles away. I mean, presumably they can prescribe antidepressants. I mean, okay, outside of the pandemic, you know, kind of accessing services at the moment is difficult, but they prescribe antidepressants, or they refer you on to somebody who can provide psychotherapy or counseling of some kind. I mean, so tell us a bit more.
So if you think about what it is like to get prescribed antidepressants, the process, and I'm not a health specialist, I'm particularly not a psychiatric specialist, but if you think about what it is to get prescribed antidepressants, you get sent to a pharmacist with a prescription, and it's a case of take these things, this is what we're going to give you, this is how often you're going to take them, and we're going to catch up in however many months' time to talk about how it's going. If it's a case of you've got to go to a museum, it's much less clear exactly what that entails. Is it you physically show up to any museum, you cross the threshold, turn around and go home? You know, do you need to look at paintings for a given amount of time in order to execute it? Does it matter what the paintings are?
I suppose I meant just much more basically. I mean, that medical professionals are actually kind of saying, if a patient comes to them and says, I'm depressed, I can't carry on, I'm really miserable, I can't get up in the morning, whatever it is, they say, well, you need to go to a museum.
That's basically what's being proposed. And I need to be clear that this isn't, again, this is not really my world, but this isn't really being proposed. But, you know, it's not as if the BMA has adopted the policy that the solution to the NHS funding crisis is to tell GPs to send people to museums. This is more something that's coming from bits of the academic literature, such as the literature that we draw on in the second chapter, from particular bits of public health, suggesting basically that I've read reports that claim that GPs aren't sufficiently well trained in the benefits of culture, and they should all be sent on a course to understand them better, so that when their depressed patients come and see them, they'll duly send them to the National Gallery.
Yeah. It's very. I mean, I have to say, it's very creepy.
Mm.
Yeah, it's tricky because, I think a lot of people have the same instinctive response that you've had, which is the same one that I have, which is, this is gross. This isn't what museums and galleries should be for. This feels a little bit irresponsible on the part of the medical establishment. But I'm not an expert in medicine. If this genuinely is helping people, then I don't see why we shouldn't do it. It's more that I think there are, as George has alluded to, it feels uncomfortable and it feels inappropriate to say that what culture is for is as an alternative to, or at least as a something to augment the failures of the social care system.
I think there's definitely that. I guess it is instrumentalization. Obviously, it doesn't account for some of the for example, the sad music that we might like to listen to, Elliott Smith, without any desire to make ourselves better or gain any instrumental benefits, and perhaps even the opposite. But I think we can probably come back to some of these questions about the benefits of culture, and just to move it on a little bit in terms of who works in culture or the cultural occupations. What's your approach here? I mean, how did you look to answer this question in the British context?
So I mentioned a little bit earlier that the way that we formally measure what's called the cultural and creative industries in the UK is quite odd. There is a list of occupations that you can get from DCMS, which is the department that notionally is in charge of the sector. And, I said already that all measurement is bad, but it means that we have, I think, a set of 10 different broad groups of cultural occupations. And so these are things like advertising and marketing, film, TV, radio and photography, museums, galleries and libraries, and so on. And so in order to try to understand cultural jobs and to understand creative work, the first thing that we wanted to do was treat these as separate from each other. Because, if you're concerned about, or at least alert to, potential inequalities in culture, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be the same for dancers and programmers. And so the way that we approach it is to look at it in a fairly macro sense, looking at the sort of national official statistics about the kinds of people working in these occupations, because, there's a lot of them. And so, we think that looking at occupations is a helpful way of understanding it, because if you want to understand what the inequalities are in visual arts as a starting point, you want to know who the visual artists are. You want to know who the curators are. Yeah. You want to know who's running the galleries.
So sorry, just to interrupt you a little bit there. In terms of, I guess, the proportion of the workforce, what sort of fraction are we looking at here in terms of people who would see themselves or would be classified as working in the cultural occupations?
Well, as in how many of the overall population in work?
Yeah, I guess just in terms of, is this a I don't want to kind of preempt the question, but this is presumably not 3/4 of the the labor force.
It's not 3/4 of the labor force, but it's not hardly anyone either. It's not that this is this incredibly marginal pursuit and it's this sort of bourgeois affectation to say, oh, aren't artists interesting? And you see this quite a lot in the response to the pandemic, because if you look at how people are discussing the sort of government response to the pandemic, there's a lot of discussion of people working cultural occupations, because on the one hand, a lot of the work has just ground to a halt, and the sorts of employment relations that these people have means that in a lot of cases they can't be put on furlough, they're not eligible for small business supports. Yeah, so it's in the sort of, depending on how you measure it, and I'm sort of keen to avoid the expansive definition where a huge amount of the sector gets swallowed up with people building software backends for Siemens. But I'm going to get this wrong, but it's sort of in the sort of 3 to 5% of people working in the UK.
Yeah, so I mean that's a fairly significant number.
It's a lot of people, and they tell us all the time, not unreasonably, that the sector makes quite a lot of money. It's not just people in their post-rock bands having a nice time and living in destitution. Telly makes a lot of money. Films make a lot of money. Games make a lot of money.
So Mark, I mean, I wondered, I'm going to be really blunt here. Why is inequality bad? I mean, in the sense that, why should we care about inequality in the arts and in culture, actually? Because it's not just the arts, is it? I mean, because of an abstract sense of justice, you think it's unfair. You think it's not, the meritocracy that it promises itself to be. But why does it actually matter in terms of what is actually produced and maybe even just in a deeper sense of culture? I mean, maybe we'll come back to what the deeper sense of culture is. But I mean, why effectively does it matter that that there isn't an equal representation in the arts? That the ballerinas are all posh. I mean, does it matter if the dancing's good? The dancing's good.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I think we've really struggled with all the way through, and I think it's an essential question, because nobody cares if accountants are all posh if the numbers add up. I mean, they don't, but there's a lot, and nobody cares if medics are all posh if they save lives. So it means that we do end up with this sort of challenge when we describe the inequalities in the sector, where we're asking, what's the problem? And largely the way that I sort of tend to approach it is that the kinds of people, and there's quite a lot of very strong evidence for this, the kinds of people working in culture informs the kind of culture that gets made. And this isn't to claim that, you have to be from a particular kind of background in order to be able to represent it in the work that we produce. It's more that the kinds of people that are producing culture are more likely to draw on these backgrounds. And we can see historically that there's a really strong relationship between the kinds of culture, the kinds of people making culture, the kinds of culture that they make, and the kinds of audiences that then emerge for that culture. And if the kinds of people making the culture are relatively narrow, that means that the products are, and that means that the audiences are. And if we think that the point of culture is to represent the nation, which a lot of people would argue that it is, then if only a narrow fraction of the nation is being represented, then that's a problem.
Well, I mean,
it's a problem.
So, but that's actually a good case, because Limmy, is a comedian who's making just silly videos on the internet, and I think maybe that points to the problem that even if you representing the nation as it is, as a kind of fixed entity, is maybe a problematic way to look at it, especially because that representation happens through the institutions, through the cultural organs that already exist, and maybe those are the problem rather than the exact way that
Alex.
say it. What? Then who
it.
They hire? Say what?
No,
you don't know what I'm going to say. It. Say what?
Say it the way you're meant to say it.
It's problematic.
No, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to.
Say it.
Problem.
There you go.
But anyway, what I mean is maybe the culture industry is the problem rather than the fact that it's not fully meritocratic, and that what it and then of course I agree with you that the consequences would be bad. The consequences of having just a bunch of posh people making culture gives you a distorted kind of cultural output, and doesn't really represent the nation, doesn't perform the role that culture should perform. But maybe I guess the way of framing it suggests that, just having a kind of more, I don't know, having a more equal intake in terms of who culture hires would not really resolve the problem.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree. Like, if you imagine in next year's BBC intake, taking the BBC as an example of a big recruiter that people love to shit on. If you imagine next year that their intake was completely representative in all the hypothetical ways that we might want to aim for of the general population, do we think that the sort of work that the BBC is going to be producing is going to be radically different? And not really. Maybe there'll be a couple of episodes of Doctors that have a slightly different tone. Maybe there'll be a little bit more interesting stuff going on Radio 2 or something else. But it's not going to be a radical transformation. This is something that we see quite strongly, where some of the cultural workers that we interviewed who are from, for example, historically marginalized backgrounds, people who don't look and sound like the people at the top, who do get hired, because, just because the cultural sector is unequal and imbalanced, it doesn't mean that everyone is exactly the same. The people in these sorts of roles tended to find it quite frustrating because they didn't have the sort of autonomy that they might have liked. The structures of the industry, as you describe, limited their ability to do what they wanted to do.
No, I
So
mean,
that's
sorry, go ahead, Phil, actually, because I'm sure your question will kind of take off from where I was leading.
well, it was just to. So, I mean, if you could tell us a bit, I suppose, if you could flesh out, make it concrete, what is a kind of exemplar or illustrative example of someone who works in UK culture industries today? What do they look like? What's the demographic? Where do they live? What might they do in terms of culture? Tell us, if you could tell us a bit about what this kind of composite kind of figure looks like.
I'll tell you about two people. So the first one is the composite figure that you describe. And the easiest question to answer based on that list that you provided is they live in London. They almost overwhelmingly live in London, and, correspondingly spend a grotesque amount of money on rent or live with their parents. Yep. The composite figure, if they're reasonably established in their career, let's say they're in their 30s or they're older, they've had a bit of experience, they've been promoted a couple of times, they're probably a man, they're probably straight, which has come as a surprise to a lot of people, they're probably white, and they probably came from a middle-class background, and when you ask them what kind of background they came from, they would describe it as very ordinary.
So George, basically.
So like, for example, you might find that somebody has grown up in Berkshire, and they weren't privately educated, but they went to a very selective school, and then they went to an elite institution. They, for example, had a bunch of higher education, and now they are, they're doing a bunch of different roles. It's not as if they've sort of landed on a crash mat. They've gone into a position paying them 80K. They might do a bit of podcasting in addition to their day job.
This is a horrible.
They'll
this is a
talk
horrible
about their
picture.
working class background all the time. About
These people sound completely intolerable. And
I mean, it's interesting because they might have a family connection to Mansfield.
They might or might not. I mean, but this is. You're the expert on this. I mean, we'll have to defer to your judgment here.
Yeah. But there's the second person I want to tell you about. So that's the sort of generic composite, and it's a very easy figure to hate. To say, this is all monsters. Yeah, sure. They're all clueless. Yeah. They have no idea about the real world beyond their own four walls.
Absolutely.
Maybe a more illustrative example, like the number of people where all of those things apply to them is quite limited. Maybe a more illustrative example is Isabel, who's one of the people that we interviewed. And Isabel, that's not a real name, works in publishing. She's got a day job. It doesn't pay brilliantly well, but it's all right. The work is quite satisfying and she loves it. She feels like she's doing something morally good and worthwhile in the world. And, and I don't disagree with that. And Isabel is Black. She's Black British. She grew up in London. And so, instantly I've told you two things that diverge from the Berkshire hate figure that I presented earlier.
Nothing wrong with Berkshire, but to continue your portrait.
Yeah, and so she's interesting for a number of reasons. Because so when she was talking to us, she told us a little bit about her background. And as I said before, there's this idea of telling a modest story. Yeah. One of the things that she referred to, for example, was that her dad's parents were teachers, and so they were lower middle class. And when she was describing how she got into working in culture, into her current role, but also more generally, she talked about how she had, her parents, it wasn't that much, but, you'd go to like art classes every Saturday morning. She'd be taken to museums as if it was the most normal thing in the world and everyone did it. And, she was going to drama classes and she quite liked it. But then it turned out that her dad's mate was an agent and she ended up getting cast in something when she was 13, she got cast in a kids show. And so she was the lead in that for a couple of years. And then, she went to uni and she kept getting sort of bits of TV work. And now she's in this theatre company. She got selected for this theatre company and, they do a day a week and they're not paid for their work, but, they have a bunch of perks accompanying it. They get various different free tickets and so on. And I think it's a really illustrative case for a number of reasons. Firstly, talking about what she's doing now, she's balancing her day job with, which she does love, in publishing, with acting that she's doing on the side. And the acting that she's doing, she's not being paid for, but it's not the kind of exploitation that we saw with some of our other participants, who'd worked in a museum for nothing for a year while everyone else was being paid. None of them are being paid. They're like, money is changing hands at some stage, when they're putting on a production at a theatre, money is changing hands, but none of it is going to them. But she has the kind of background that makes a lot of these things relatively seamless. She was going to these classes as a child, and then her dad's mate was an agent, and then that agent knew somebody else, which meant that after she'd done the first show, she was able to get put forward for something else. And it's this modest story of all of this stuff being the most normal thing in the world that you could understand that if you weren't from the kind of background where, your dad's mate was an agent, as with a lot of the other people that we spoke to, it's just another world and you couldn't imagine how this would be penetrable. And so, we had a lot of people who, and, with that story, like a lot of it she's not being paid for, it's not necessarily satisfying, but none of it is wasted time.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the other people that we spoke to, they'd be working for free. They'd be doing these unpaid internships. They'd be putting on these productions where somebody else was getting paid, and they knew the work was bad. And it was a waste of time. It wasn't taking them anywhere, but they sort of had to keep themselves warm.
Yeah. I mean, that does, to be fair, I mean, that does sound a bit like George again, even if it is the second character. But anyway, one of the things I wanted to dig into a bit was the political attitudes of UK cultural producers.
Yeah.
And basically, you find, I mean, to my great surprise, that they tend to be a bit on the left. And even more interestingly and surprisingly, they tend to support the European Union. They tend to have voted Remain.
Oh, look, Phil's talking about Brexit. That's interesting. How did we end up there?
Hey, what? Don't interrupt. And more strongly, even strikingly, they're more strongly pro-Remain and perhaps even less happy to be leaving the European Union than potential other groups in the population. At the same time as being more politically engaged. So I was wondering if you could talk us through the political attitudes of this social group a bit more.
And sorry, just to jump in here before you answer, Mark. I guess that there is something here about obviously this group of people that we're talking about in general having probably an outsized influence on politics across a number of different national contexts. So yeah, I guess obviously the UK example has some specific aspects to it, but I think there's probably a more general point here about what are the political attitudes of cultural producers and are they politically important?
So again, we sort of run into this problem of like, what is the problem here? Like, why is it an issue if people working in the cultural sector have political attitudes that aren't exactly the same as the general population? Nobody is particularly worried that bankers are right wing, for example. And, so we end up with this challenge where, and I should be clear, it's not like a monoculture. It's not as if every single person who's in these data sets, every single person that we spoke to is sort of like full FBPE dad, like consistently voting Lib Dem as hard as they can. It is a mix, but compared with the general population, they are noticeably more left-wing, and they're more liberal in terms of, some of the ways that you might measure liberal attitudes. And so partly it's what you describe, that the representation crisis, which I described earlier, saying, if these people are drawn from a relatively narrow part of the population, can they really represent can they represent everyone? Similarly, if people are drawn from a relatively narrow set of perspectives and values, are they actually going to be able to represent the nation in a non-patronizing way? And, everyone in this conversation can think of examples where well-meaning left liberals who want to make people's lives better end up delivering sort of ham-fisted, patronizing content. And to be clear, the values that I'm describing about sort of like left liberal, like they're not very keen on the EU, but they're much less keen on not being in the EU. These are my values. I'm not setting up like something that I'm in opposition to as a problem. I'm saying that people who think like me is a problem if that's all we have in this position. I mean, equally, I think it's worth sort of introducing a note of caution. There's the sort of famous Kurt Vonnegut description of the Vietnam War, where all of arts and culture was sort of laser focused on opposition, and it turned out to have the power of a custard pie dropped from the top of a ladder. I think it's worth looking at the other side of this, though, as well, where there's a temptation to think of people working in culture as tremendously powerful and influential. And if they really were as powerful and influential as everybody makes out, then the tone of political discourse, the sort of attitudes that people hold, looking at things like electoral behavior, you would expect to be quite different. One way that you can understand it is if we look at how, if the claim is that the cultural sector is enormously out of touch, then it means that you end up with a consequence that I think you're seeing now in a lot of ways, that they're just not really taken very seriously.
Yeah, right. I mean, I certainly feel that way about a lot of political
the power of that custard pie dropped from a ladder.
Yeah.
But to move on to the, maybe we've talked about who works in culture a little bit, something about the benefits of culture, but who, Alex, I think you had a question on consuming culture as a cultural consumer yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm speaking of consumption. I'm disappointed it wasn't a fruit pie of some sort dropped from a great height. But anyway,
I thought you were going to say,
we'll
talking
deal
of
with
consumption, you have
yeah, I've got
commiserations.
But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of consumption of culture, I mean, it's obviously not a kind of one-to-one relationship between who produces and who consumes or anything like that. And I think we can obviously imagine who consumes culture if you think about who goes to the opera. I can imagine what the answer to that would be, and I think most listeners could imagine likewise. But of course, if you want to surprise us with some actual facts, please go ahead and do so, Mark. But otherwise, I mean, are there any kind of relevant patterns that you discovered that you thought were particularly interesting in terms of the consumption of culture, how it's done, where it's done, by whom?
Yeah, so I think opera is an interesting example because, I think like the previous Northern Powerhouse minister and the now president of the Northern Research Group is claiming that, that while opera and ballet might be the standard form of participation and community engagement in London and the South, that football, in fact, holds the same role in the north of England, which is where I live. And I think it's an illustrative example because for a lot of people, there's this idea of, this elite that are attending all of these kind of activities. It's really, really prominent in sort of middle class circles. And the important thing to say about opera is that hardly anyone goes. About 4% of people said that they went to the opera in the last 12 months. It is heavily stratified by social class. If we think about the sort of formal definition of social class in a UK context, which I will not get into, you're looking at about 6% of people who work in managerial or professional jobs, or where the main income earner in the household is doing that, went to the opera in the last 12 months. Whereas in working class households, you're looking at about 1%. And on the one hand, that's a very clear demonstration of social inequality in cultural consumption. On the other hand, it flags how much a lot of the sort of high culture that we talk about and draw attention to, these are niche interests. Even classical music, which is something that is held up as a real exemplar of middle class culture as opposed to elite culture, is only 13% of middle class people having gone in the previous 12 months. So a lot of this stuff is really, really niche. And one of the challenges with a lot of this kind of work is that you can only talk confidently about who's going to things when they're the things that you're measuring. So I can tell you about opera, and I can tell you about ballet, and I can tell you about things like films, going to a film at cinema, and I can talk to you about going to gigs and so on. But I can't talk very reliably about things like going to football. I can't talk very reliably about stand-up. I also can't talk very confidently about a lot of more niche forms of activity. And because I think everybody's got a kind of instinct. And, if you've gone to a bunch of post-rock shows, there's a sort of running joke about how limited the audience is. And, you're seeing the same set of bald white guys every week. And that's probably true. There are very clear pattern. We would expect the dynamics that you see in terms of social class, gender and ethnicity to reproduce themselves in a lot of the forms that we have good data on. We can't be confident. Similarly, of some of the things that we have pretty good data, like not everything adheres to this pattern. You would assume from this description that, every single event is full of middle-class white guys. And while that's true of a lot of things, it's not true of everything. Something that's measured quite well, for example, is rates of attendance at stuff like what's called culturally specific festivals, carnivals, circus, and so on, which is much more of a mix. But yeah, broadly, you see quite striking patterns in terms of social class, where middle class people are more likely to go, ethnic group, where white people are much more likely to go, even net of class differences, and also age, where a lot of this activity really skews heavily towards older people.
Yeah. So I guess just to follow up on this quickly, I mean, putting to one side perhaps some of the more theoretical questions about whether it's important to essentially embrace cultural products or reject them, in terms of, it's not about what people end up consuming, it's about what they think is unacceptable to consume. But in terms of, I guess, kind of international comparison, or putting some of the things that we've talked about, which I guess have been, the research is based on the UK, that's a starting point. I mean, are these sorts of things found all across the world? It seems like a fairly kind of standard picture, or one which would probably kind of point to other contexts as well, because you have that association of certain cultural consumption behaviors with certain groups.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of literature from different parts of the world. Obviously, in different countries, things get measured slightly differently. There's different activities that you're looking at, and so on. But the picture is pretty consistent, regardless of where you go. There's a lot of literature in the Anglosphere. There's quite a lot of literature in the Nordic countries as well, where you might expect, given the ways that people talk about social democracy, that things would be more even. They're not. There's other countries where we can't be as sure, because the data isn't as maybe up to the same, not as much money has been spent on measuring this. But more or less, regardless of where you're looking, you see very similar kinds of patterns to what we describe. One of the big differences that we've been able to unpack is to look at the production end of things as well. Consumption these inequalities are reproduced all over the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sounds like a pattern that will be repeated with national variations across the world. So I think Phil had a question, maybe to kind of move on to some of the more synoptic or concluding questions. Phil had something on COVID.
Yeah, just basic. I mean, you talk about COVID. So what do you see of the short-term and the long-term effects of the pandemic on the cultural industries?
It will only get worse, is the short answer. In the last couple of weeks.
Worse in what sense?
Well, if you think that it's bad that people working in the cultural sector are disproportionately from sort of middle class backgrounds, disproportionately have independent sources of wealth, then, wait 2 years where no cultural work is getting paid. The picture, once it comes back, is going to be even more pronouncedly different. Obviously every country is different, but when you look at a UK context, a huge number of cultural workers haven't been eligible for things like furlough or self-employment income support, all of these kinds of schemes. And so the numbers of people who are basically reporting that they're going to drop out of the workforce because they can't afford to have no work for the foreseeable future, and indeed the unforeseeable future, is enormous. Whereas, other people, if you're independently wealthy, you can spend 2 years writing songs, or you can put together your screenplay, or whatever else it is. And so it's not looking good, if those are your concerns.
Yeah. I suppose, like you say, it is as you'd expect.
I guess the question is, though, just to kind of zoom out a little bit and I guess return back to one of the questions we started with about why the culture industry might or might not be bad. I mean, what's the, aside from potentially some sympathy with some of our listeners who may well be in cultural occupations or something adjacent and might well be going through not a particularly easy time, like why would this matter politically if that if we do see that change?
Okay, I didn't foresee that, and so I had assumed I would have an amazing answer. I will jump right in, but if you're wondering why the pause was so long, that's why.
That just means it was a good question.
Yeah.
Actually, it was a question that I extemporized. So the actual question bit ended up being very short, and the introduction bit quite long. So
part of it, I think, has to do with questions of social inequality more generally. In a lot of ways, and for a lot of sort of theorists in the field, creative industries, cultural work, whatever you want to call it, exemplifies a lot of problems of work in general. This is a group of people whose labor relations have changed, who are becoming sort of increasingly in something like a gig economy. Their pay is getting worse, their conditions are getting worse. And these are jobs that, at least in the past, have had some sort of association with autonomy and dignity. And if the sorts of jobs that people want to do, that people find satisfying, are increasingly limited to people who come into them with independent wealth, then I think that's a clear problem. I'm not sure that that's the extent of the problem, because, if that doesn't tell you anything about the creative work specifically. It tells you a story about work. And, one of the things that we really try to communicate in the book is that on the one hand, creative jobs really are distinctive, but on the other hand, they're jobs. And, people shouldn't be willing to put up with bad treatment just because it's satisfying to be in a creative role. There is this idea, and you see this quite a lot, that, creativity is the thing that will bring us together. That at the moment we're going through this sort of global nightmare where, and you have these mawkish adverts where there's a ballerina having to perform on her roof because she can't be in a theatre or an opera house doing the work properly, and everyone cries because we love it so much. And this stuff gets effectively weaponized by Amazon or whoever else, because people do buy into it. They do buy into the idea that this stuff is important and this is who we want to be. And if who we want to,
creativity is always a good thing. Who's against creativity?
Yeah. And, it's easy to take the piss out of it. It's easy to say, this is just something that Amazon is using so that we buy, we subscribe to Prime and we get a load of boxes or whatever. But it is capturing something that people genuinely believe. And so if the culture that gets represented on Return is limited to the sort of Benedict Cumberbatches of the world, there is a concern about how inspirational that's going to be. And I can't believe I'm defending the Amazon ads where we're happy because the opera's back, and the opera is it's this sort of misleading set of people who certainly wouldn't work there in the real world. But if it gets worse, then you just can't imagine a reconciliation, a sort of national reconciliation that's convincing.
No, that's a kind of a fairly grim picture then. And now I just have Benedict Culturebatch in my head. I don't know why that's just happened. So maybe we just
if I brought nothing else to this podcast.
That's the big takeaway right there.
I think that's probably on you, Alex.
Yeah, that is on me. Okay, well we'll just conclude here. Thank you, Mark. That was actually really interesting.
Cheers.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Increasingly, I find myself thinking that you can perform distinction about anything. There is not a single cultural form that you can't be a hipster about.
Right.
Metal's a really easy example because, there's going to see Metallica and looking like you're in Bill and Ted or something. But there's also going to see the difficult thrash or the difficult sort of doom or whatever. The highest cultural form is, of course, professional wrestling, which is very much a form that it is possible to be a hipster about, because you're dismissing the cultural hegemony of the WWE, the big Trump fundraiser, and the MBS sort of propaganda machine. But instead, you might be following New Japan, but then, of course, you dismiss New Japan and you start discovering the audience to 50 people in a converted dentist office. Increasingly, I think an amazing way of performing distinction is finding the lowest possible cultural form and finding a high cultural way of consuming it.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and it works very well, right? Because it allows you to say, this is the thing that I don't like, and if you like it, then that's a problem. But I like everything else, like all the other bits of it. But just that one thing, it shows that you don't really have the cultural capital necessary to function.
Yeah, that thing that you think is bad is actually good, but for incredibly niche reasons.
Well, I mean, I guess that's like the kind of breakdown of kind of mainstream, or the mainstream. I was going to say mainstream culture, but I mean the mainstream.
Lamestream.
Yeah, the lamestream. Yeah, well, because everybody now kind of hates lamestream. Everybody's kind of an outsider, and cultural elite. I mean, those with high cultural capital, as you've just been saying, are kind of consuming low culture things, albeit maybe ironically and whatever. So everybody's an outsider, and therefore maybe there is no real kind of cultural outside anymore in the way that maybe certain subcultures kind of did represent an outside. But maybe that's an opportunity to actually ask, because I'm curious, Mark. Is there anything that you think, as an observer of culture, that there is something really out there and that's really outside and that couldn't even particularly be appropriated by, well-to-do, kind of well-connected people, because it's too weird or too out there? Because basically, I want to get ahead of the game, just to preempt the
I mean, I honestly can't think of anything, but I think this is one of the consequences of being in my mid-30s, that I'm now hilariously out of touch with anything actually cool.
Yeah, that does happen. Not to me, obviously. I listen to Type O Negative, which is very cool.
It's very contemporary.
Yes.
There is a question about what is going to be the 90s or noughties band that's going to be rediscovered or rehabilitated or retromaniaed, and hopefully we can cash in on that, because we're getting to that age now where we're not falling between two stools anymore. We were there when McCluskey played.
The weirdest experience that I've had of this, there's two good examples. The first one is last year I went to see McCluskey at the Brudenell in Leeds, and the Brudenell has got two main gig rooms. They both hold roughly the same number of people, and McCluskey were in one and the Lighthouse family were in the other one, and so there was a real tension in the bar. But the thing that strikes me most is
we're gonna sorry, Mark, we're gonna have to cut this because like there will be 3 listeners who will know who McCluskey and Lighthouse family were. But James and I were at the London leg of that McCluskey reunion tour. But sorry, I interrupted your
So story. The other example is maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I was teaching, some students were doing some group work, and, amongst other things, I think they were first years, they just arrived, they've been talking about what they'd done that summer. And they were talking about, a couple of them had been to the Leeds Festival. Remember that these are students who were, this is maybe a couple of years ago now, so they were maybe born in sort of 99, 2000. And they were talking about how, they'd been at this festival and it was really amazing, and they'd been so thrilled because they had been able to see the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And my jaw was on the floor, that I couldn't believe that, this isn't just me being a snob, that it's not like there's been
it totally is. It totally is.
Yeah.
I think people,
it's not like they've got into
I think everybody
Radiohead.
Consensus. Yeah.
So maybe it's that. Maybe the big next cultural renaissance is going to be for the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
I take it back about Family Guy. The Red Hot Chili Peppers are the best, in fact.
That Californication album, it's pretty good shit. I like how all their songs are about about how drugs and heroin.
Yeah.
Well, I like how they've managed to bring together California, and on the other hand fornication, which is what their album title is, and it's been welded.
That's true.
Quite skillfully, I think.
I mean, yeah. But yeah, no, sorry. Thanks, Mark. That was really a lot of fun, notwithstanding your critique of some Berkshire-based pod. I mean, did you have somebody in mind? Because I was kind of thinking I'd probably be good friends with this person that you're describing here. They sound kind of cool. They sound kind of good.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is I was trying to remember the name of your dad's band.
Joint venture.
Joint venture. I was trying to, because I remember Rumpy Pumpy was the song.
it was actually Hanky Panky.
Hanky
Pumpy.
That's just the cherry on top. Cherry on top. But your father is the apple of your eye. So
they were called Joint Venture because they would smoke marijuana like it was a cigarette. And
There's a double meaning.
play their music.
It's a drug reference. That makes them cool.
But also, it's a collaboration between people.
Yeah.
It's actually a good name.
I think this is probably...
might start up a podcast called that.
Let's
let's
wrap it up,
podcast.
guys. I think we're done for this evening.
That's when it all gets